Last Tuesday, I, like many of you, watched the presidential debate. And not thinking that watching that mess alone was a good idea, I called up a friend and I said, "Hi, I'm coming to your house on Tuesday night. Do you want me to bring dinner?" And she was very generous. She said, "No, I'll even provide dinner." So I said, "Okay, that's a good plan." But on the way home, I had some things I needed to pick up for some people that were in need. So I had to stop at two grocery stores. And I found myself suddenly transported from the middle of September to Christmas Eve. Now, I say it's Christmas Eve because in my line of work, I have been that person grabbing the butter just before the stores close on Christmas Eve. And it's an otherworldly experience of emptiness. There's nobody on the highways, there's nobody in the parking lots, there's nobody in the stores. And that's how it was on Tuesday night. It seemed that everybody was either home watching the debate or holed up with great intention not watching the debate. Because here is the thing. We are at a pivotal point in history. It's a fulcrum. And we are being offered the chance to join that cloud of witnesses that I talked about before our prayer today, to engage our minds and our bodies and our spirits in service of the future. And some of us will choose to do that in some ways, and others of us will choose to do that in other ways. The knowledge of this and the stakes that are at risk here, I think, is putting all of us a bit on edge, causing anxiety, a little grumpiness, a lot of disengagement from some things. But this is not the time that we want to look back and say, oh, during that pivotal moment, I was disengaged and feeling overwhelmed. And because when one is overwhelmed, there's a resource to be found in actual faith communities, which is the opportunity to connect to something larger than yourself. I'm going to pose to you a very strange proposition, which is that this particular moment in time offers us amazing opportunities for spiritual engagement. Now, historian and writer Heather Cox Richardson, in her book Democracy Awakening, says that our democracy has been involved in this tension between the rights of the powerful and the rights of the people since our inception. And Cox Richardson's newest work opens with Abraham Lincoln and his efforts to keep a nation from fracturing forever. She says that's a time we should be looking at now, for we are in that time in this moment. And at the heart of that fracturing, she points out, are many of the same questions because they never truly went away. Some of them embedded themselves or moved a few degrees lower, but they were always there still. She points out that this is a question that we've had since the time of European settlement on these shores, which is the question of who is this nation for? Who is it truly designed to include? She says this: America is at a crossroads. A country that once stood as the global symbol of democracy has been teetering on the brink of authoritarianism. How did this happen? Is the fall of democracy in the United States inevitable? And if not, how can we reclaim our democratic principles? The crisis in American democracy crept up on many of us. For generations of Americans, grainy news footage from World War II shows row upon row of Nazi soldiers goose-stepping in military parades that tricked us into thinking that the Adolf Hitlers of the world arrive at the head of giant armies. So long as we didn't see tanks in our streets, we imagined that democracy was secure. But in fact, she says, Hitler's rise to absolute power began with his consolidation of political influence. It began with winning 36.8% of the vote in 1932, which he parlayed into a deal to become the German chancellor. The absolute dictatorship, she said, came afterwards. In an election in which one of the candidates has been public in his assertions that if he wins, he does not plan to relinquish power, history lessons should be noted. Those who would embrace dictatorship build their platforms on false lies and false history. And Cox Richardson points out they thrive especially at the nexus of inequality and private greed. Truly, at this time, we find ourselves as keepers of faith because so many people are disillusioned, disheartened, tired of what for a choice between the lesser of two evils. We who understand that our interdependence is our survival have a rich legacy here to fuel us. We have people in our past, such as Unitarian and also Universalist Thomas Starr King, who was lauded by Abraham Lincoln as the person responsible for keeping California in the Union with his tireless efforts, not just preaching for the cause on Sunday mornings in the San Francisco pulpit not very far from here, but rather week after week and night after night in the labor halls and farmers' fields. Poor People's Campaign leader, Reverend Dr. William Barber, points out that we have 135 million poor people in our nation, and that 50% of the children in our country are being brought up by low-wage earners. Barber notes that we should especially pay attention to the fact that while often the higher poverty rates among people of color are noted, 30% of white people in this country live in poverty, and that provides fertile ground for false hopes tied to other worlds yet to come rather than those grounded in a place today where many people do not see opportunity. Juxtapose this growing income disparity against what has happened since the U.S. Supreme Court decided to end many of the restrictions on excessive uses of money in politics. And that has fueled the disinformation and misinformation that we'll be talking about this afternoon. It has been used not only to divide us, but also to convince us that those who are asking for these divisions are only asking for their rights. It's a strategy that Cox Richardson points out has been used for generations and centuries. If you look at the history of this nation, you will see that faith has been a key ingredient in fueling the spiritual endurance to address systemic changes. Yes, there is a frightening, creeping Christian nationalism today that falsely claims its sole right to the Christian inheritance. And yet when I think about the power of faith, I think about the people holding their Bibles as they walked over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or the prayers of a community that accompanied the first black children to integrate schools. I think of engaged Buddhist Thich Nhat Hanh, whose words we sang today, comforting his people as refugees of war. This is the kind of spiritual response, one grounded in deep spiritual endurance that we need to re-summon into our minds in this time. This is why we as a congregation are participating in UU the Vote, in our postcard drives, and tomorrow launching new work with Faith in Action East Bay to combat some of the insidious ballot measures on the California ballot, which you may not have even been paying attention to because there are so many other things claiming your attention. We cannot afford to take faithful action out of the equation. We need to remember that our interdependence, our belief, our strong grounding in our belief in interdependence with those who are facing what Emory University's Carol Anderson calls the Scare the Vote campaigns must be present. Voter disenfranchisement is on the rise, and we need a Congress that would put back in a Voting Rights Act and end those one-person, no-vote politics that we're seeing all over our nation today. There's fear-mongering around race. How many times did we hear immigrants blamed for every problem on Tuesday night? How many times? I actually was trying to count. I actually lost count. It is clear that we need a new immigration system, as clear as it is that it is time for us to look at the very premises of how we do democracy in this country, for there are other approaches, and perhaps it's time that ours evolves. But we must think about these issues which are critical in this election and issues that we must continue to work on after November. You know, voter suppression is a down ballot issue. It's one where it's mostly seen in the smaller offices, the lower offices, the local offices. And we need to pay attention to those. We need people committed to democracy at all levels of our government. And it's important that we pay attention to who is taking those important and key places of decision making. So let's go back to our spiritual endurance. Because it's a lot. It's a lot, isn't it a lot? It's a lot, yeah. So much of what we face today is grounded in fear. Real fears, like the fears of what's happening to our climate, and fears that are being manufactured to distract us from the ways that a very small group of people is benefiting from the destruction of the institutions that have kept us safe throughout our lifetimes. We need to model what it means to look at the truth. Thich Nhat Hanh says, we have to see the real truth, the real situation. For him, it's meditation. He says meditation is to see deeply into things, to see how they can change, how we can change, how we can transform our situation. To transform our situation, he says, is to transform our minds. To transform our minds is also to transform our situation, because situation is mind, and mind is situation. Awakening, he says, is important. With our UU values of equity and justice, we need to find, dust off, and reinvent practices to ground us and give us the fortitude and courage and endurance to oppose those who believe that some people have more value than others. In a more inclusive and equitable agenda, we would see an end to this delusion that we are being divided by those who have the least power in our society. Many of us who have been at the margins of that picture are still understand that this is a tactic that also has been used for centuries. Cox Richardson says, more often than not, those articulating the nation's true principles have been the marginalized Americans who demanded that the nation honor its founding promises. Their struggles have constantly renewed the country's dedication to its principles articulated in the Declaration of Independence. So in this way, when we hear people who would limit our progress and have us go back to times that were simpler for some, but not simpler for everyone, better for some, but not better for everyone, they find it easy to demonize people who are asking for full rights that they should have had for centuries ago. And that is, in fact, what they are asking for, but that is not what is causing these divisions. I invite people to listen to the different voices that are across the spectrum of belief. People who might cast a ballot for the same person you are, but for different reasons. It is time for us to end these either-or ways of thinking about our world, which is so complex and has so many nuances. I invite you once again, as I did last spring, to talk to people across generations, to hear what's important to them, to hear what's keeping them going to the polls, or what in some cases is keeping them from doing so out of principle. Especially, I invite you, as you think about those young people asking for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, to hear it through the lens of the peace movement and other lenses that have come before that, for it is the same issue. So let us build up our spiritual resilience. Let us hold true to our principles and be the people of faith who are here for this election and beyond, here to address the income divide and also the divide among us about who matters. We need to find ways to begin to talk about the real threats that we're being distracted from, the threats of climate change, the threats of economic division, the threats of income inequality, the threats to our democracy that have been ruled by these courts and need to be re-legislated in our times to be addressed. Many of us are working to maintain a doorway for democracy. Others are peering through, asking for assurance that that other work on the other side of that doorway is going to be done. Let us spend our time in dialogue with one another. Let us not spend our time attacking one another. Let us do this, though. Remember that we need our spiritual endurance, this rigorous pursuit of truth, this recognition of our interdependence, that all are needed. We have so many ways that we can act. As we can attend our sessions on mis and disinformation today, we can be one of the people finishing the end of our 3,000 postcards that we've almost completed as a congregation. We can be a poll worker. We can participate in phone banks. We can go door to door. We can register for the climate revival at the end of the month. There are many ways to keep our faith, but what we know is that we must engage in that spirit of endurance that we will need. For that cloud of witnesses, most of them are not the Abraham Lincolns or the Thomas Starr Kings. Most of them are our hardworking ancestors, our immigrant grandparents, the firsts who crossed the boundaries on various aspects of their identities. Most of them are just people who showed up, were willing to push past their fear to stay engaged with what was happening, and waited through the long struggles for a slightly more just world. So may we join their ranks and boost our spirits to allow us to one day be claimed as part of that cloud of witnesses. This is our moment. May we seize it.